Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Laura. I'm going to switch gears and talk about taxes. There is a lot to talk about this year because President Obama has a whole slew of tax proposals in his new budget. Some of them we've seen before, some of them are new. And he also released a corporate tax reform paper last week, which has some interesting stuff in it, and I'll talk about that as well. Some of the administration's rhetoric on taxes sounds pretty good. The new budget talks about tax reform over and over. It talks about everyone playing by the same rules in the tax code. It talks about abolishing loopholes. And in the budget, there's a big headline that says, simplify the tax code and lower tax rates, quote unquote. But unfortunately, the administration does the exact opposite. The administration's tax plan adds loopholes to the tax code, it adds complexity, and it also raises individual income tax rates. His proposals, despite him using the phrase tax reform over and over, his proposals really go in the opposite direction of the 1986 Bipartisan Tax Reform Act. So let me talk a little bit about his individual income tax changes first, and then I'll go on to the corporate stuff. As I'm sure all of you know, President Obama would raise the top two individual income tax rates. The top rate would go back up to 40%. In fact, it would go over 40% because he has provisions to phase out exemptions and deductions for high income taxpayers, which essentially raises marginal tax rates. He's also already added a 3.8% new tax on investment income for high earners under his health care plan. So the effect of this will be to reduce productive activities by high earners and to increase unproductive activities like tax avoidance and evasion. High earners have larger behavioral responses to tax changes than other Americans, and so there will be a large response to these tax changes, in my view. The administration's rhetoric, and President Obama's rhetoric in particular, often talks as if rich people are sort of these useless Wall Street speculator types who don't really add anything to the economy. The reality is that most of the people who populate the very top end of the income spectrum are highly productive people who are extremely important for the economy. I recently dug into the data on doctors and surgeons in the United States. There are 700,000 doctors and surgeons in the United States. Their average salaries by profession range from about $210,000 a year to over $500,000 a year. Doctors and surgeons work very long hours, have a very tough jobs in general. Their incomes put a bullseye on their back by President Obama's tax increases. They are exactly the type of people who are going to get hit by President Obama's tax rate increases, and so their response is they will reduce their labor supply over time, they will reduce the number of hours they work, they will retire earlier, and they will make other changes that will be bad for the economy and bad for all of us. So what about Warren Buffett? The president talks about Warren Buffett a lot. Warren Buffett has a tax rate, an average tax rate of about 17%, according to Mr. Buffett. And Buffett and Obama go around saying that, this tax rate is much lower than Mr. Buffett's secretary, supposedly. But Mr. Buffett is an anomaly. If you look at if you look at IRS data, people who make over $1 million a year, their average tax rate's about 25%. You have to go to the extreme high end of the tax spectrum, above $10 million, for average tax rates to start falling, because people at the extreme high end mainly get a lot of capital gains a lot of capital gains income. Capital gains faces a 15% rate, and that reduces the average rate for people at the extreme top end, such as Mr. Buffett. But let's take a closer look here. The IRS publishes data for the top 400 taxpayers in the United States, and they've been doing this for a couple of decades. Most of the income in that very top elite group of 400 earners, I imagine Bill Gates is in there as well as Mr. Buffett, most of the income is capital gains income. And the IRS actually traces who's in that top 400 group every year over the last couple decades. And they found that 73% of those people only were in the top 400 once during the last 2 decades. That means these people in the very top excuse me, are very dynamic. There's different people every year. And so what is going on is that there's a lot of small and medium-sized business owners in this top group who spend their whole lives building up their business. Then they have a one-time sale of their business. When they retire, they get a big capital gain. They spike to the top of the income spectrum. But people like Mr. Buffett, who are consistently in that very top group, it's an anomaly. That top group is very dynamic. So President Obama, they sort of ignore the dynamism in that top group, and they also ignore the basic reasons why we have a lower capital gains and dividend tax rate. The capital gains and dividend tax rate federally is 15%, as you know. Every industrial country has special provisions that reduce their capital gains and dividend tax rate, and there are multiple reasons for this. One is that corporate equity is double taxed. Capital gains and dividends have generally already faced taxation at the corporate level. So as every other country has figured out, you need a lower rate on capital gains and dividends at the individual level to make up for that double taxation. So for example, Ernst & Young did a survey I noticed a couple weeks ago in a new study of capital gains tax rates in the 34 OECD countries. The average capital gains tax rate in the OECD is 18%. In the United States, we've got a 15% federal rate and an average state rate of about 4%, so putting us at 19%. Again, the international average is about 18%. So we're not doing anything exceptional with our lower 15% capital gains tax rate. That's what just about every other country does. Similarly, on the dividend side, even our dividend tax rate of 15%, if you add it to the corporate 35% federal rate, our total burden on dividends is actually one of the highest in the OECD. President Obama would raise our 15% dividend tax rate back up to 40%, where it was before the Bush tax cuts a decade ago. That would be really unfortunate because what it would do is it would add back a big distortion in the tax code, which is that debt is favored over equity in the tax code. And the reason is because interest is deductible at the corporate level, dividends are not. By hiking the dividend tax rate back up to 40%, we will be encouraging U.S. corporations to become over-leveraged, to favor debt over equity, which, again, is bad for the economy in general. So I'm really disappointed that the Obama administration would reverse some of these important tax reductions that took place over the last decade, and I think they would add distortions to the economy, not fix anything. So let me jump over to corporations. To the Obama administration's credit, introduced a new corporate tax reform plan. Last week, it would cut the federal corporate tax rate from 35% down to 28%. State taxes corporate taxes are about 5%, so the U.S. corporate rate would be about 33%, 28% federal, 5% state level tax. The average corporate rate in the OECD now is just 25%. The average rate in the European Union just 23%. So we would still be far above most other industrial countries on our corporate rate. But nonetheless, kudos to the administration for realizing that the high corporate rate is a problem. But other than the rate cut, most of the rest of Obama's corporate tax proposals, in my view, they're incoherent, they're self-contradictory, they don't make any economic sense. The best example of this is probably on loopholes. President Obama rails against corporate tax loopholes, but his own budget adds many new business loopholes for green cars, green buildings, manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, growth zones. He has a new 10% wage credit for business, and on and on and on. All these new loopholes that President Obama would add distortion and complexity to the tax code, even though he says he wants to simplify it. One of the other ironies is that many of the loopholes that President Obama goes after, in my view, they aren't real loopholes. And I'll give you two sort of examples in two areas. He goes after multinational corporations and he goes after conventional energy, oil and gas companies. So on multinational corporations, the main thrust of Obama's proposals is to penalize the foreign operations of U.S. multinational companies. Companies like General Electric, Ford, Intel Corporation. These U.S. headquartered companies have operations all around the world. President Obama's thrust is to penalize their foreign operations. the Obama administration is working from a standpoint that these foreign operations of U.S. companies are bad for the economy. The reverse is true. There's been lots of research on this, and the reality is that the subsidiaries of U.S. multinational companies generally complement domestic production. So when General Electric, to make up a hypothetical, opens a new subsidiary in, say, Brazil, the main purpose of that Brazilian subsidiary is to serve the Brazilian market. It generally would complement GE's domestic production. It would, the foreign subsidiaries suck exports out of the United States. So generally, the more international U.S. corporations are, the more it allows them to export U.S. products around the world. And that sort of understanding that foreign operations are good for the U.S. economy seems to elude this administration. The administration's proposals to penalize foreign income of companies, it goes in the opposite direction of the direction that most other advanced countries are taking with their corporate tax code. Most advanced nations, Netherlands, Germany, France, Canada, have moved to what are called territorial tax systems. The Dutch government, for example, would not care and would not tax the operations of a subsidiary of a Dutch company in, say, Brazil. That Brazilian subsidiary could earn profits, and the Dutch government wouldn't care and wouldn't tax it. That territorial approach of allowing your multinationals to operate abroad is competitive. It is good for the domestic economy, and unfortunately, President Obama goes in the opposite direction. He has a dozen supposed loophole closers for multinationals that, in my view, most of them would complexify the tax code. A few would simplify it, admittedly. Most would complexify it, and most of them would penalize the foreign operations of U.S. companies. Finally, on energy, President Obama loves to rail against the loopholes that oil and gas companies supposedly get and coal companies. And indeed, there is if you look at the official lists of tax loopholes or tax expenditures that are put out by the Treasury and the Joint Tax Committee, there is a whole list of apparent tax loopholes that oil, gas, and coal companies receive. But you have to understand that there is a liberal bias in these official lists of tax expenditures. That bias is a bias against savings and investment. So if you, conservative, libertarian, pro-market economists like a model of a consumption-based tax system. Liberals have a different model of the optimal tax system, which is a broad-based income tax system. Most of the loopholes for oil, gas, and coal companies disappear if you consider the baseline or model to be a consumption-based system. So many of the loopholes listed for oil and gas companies are provisions that allow these companies to simply expense their costs rather than depreciate and amortize them over time. In my view, then, these are not actual real loopholes. They actually are simplifying pro-investment provisions that every company would be allowed to do if we had a consumption-based tax system. So if you go back a few years, and if you're interested in that topic, the Bush administration, to its credit, one year had a detailed discussion of all the tax loopholes in these official lists and what tax loopholes are not real tax loopholes if we had a consumption-based system. Anyway, one of the ironies here is that, so in my view, many of these conventional energy industry loopholes that President Obama wants to close aren't real loopholes, but at the same time, he does add a whole bunch of real loopholes for renewable energy company, windmills and solar power and green cars and green buildings and this kind of stuff. So I think the administration is very confused in its understanding of what a real loophole is. I'm going to wrap up there. I'll wrap up with a quote. President Obama's budget says, quote, "The tax code has become increasingly complicated and unfair." I wholeheartedly agree with that, but unfortunately, I don't think the President's proposals would make it any better. Indeed, they generally make the problem worse. I'm going to end there, and I guess we can go to questions.